What is up, YouTube? Naka and Magnus are by far the top blitz and rapid players in the world right now, and they have treated us to some spectacular battles in recent months. In this video, we will go over a game they played on chess.com in which both of them start with a very unusual opening. So let's just get started. Naka with the white pieces opens the game with pawn to a3. And let's quickly, before we go on, discuss what are some ideas that white has by playing this pawn to a3. Obviously, he is not controlling any of the central squares, which is something we want to do right out of the opening. But instead, with pawn to a3, what Naka wants to do is maybe in the future play this pawn to b4, play the bishop to b2, play pawn to e3, knight to f3, and at that time start putting pressure on the center squares. Here, Carlsen, after pawn to a3, continues with pawn to g5, another unusual move by the world champion, but the idea is very clever. Not only are we controlling these two squares at the moment, but we're opening the square on g7 for our bishop and anticipating the fact that white wants to play pawn to b4, and then after the bishop comes to g7, we're going to start putting pressure on this rook on a1 very quickly. The other idea that this pawn move to g5 has is that if we anticipate that white wants to play pawn to b4 and expand here on the queen side, most likely they're not going to castle that way. In anticipation of that, Carlsen wants to provoke this knight to come to f3, after which this pawn will come to g4, attacking the knight, and then he can start a pawn avalanche here on the king side with moves like h5, h4, and a very quick attack if Nakamura decides to castle here on the king side. So after pawn to g5, Naka just decides to go for e4. Let's play some normal chess now. Now this pawn is controlling very key squares here on d5 and f5. Carlsen here responds with pawn to c5. This pawn is also putting additional pressure here on d4 so that Nakamura cannot just develop his pieces to the ideal squares. But Nakamura does so anyway. He goes for pawn to d4 right away, taking advantage of the fact that this pawn here is now hanging because his bishop is attacking it. Another very possible scenario that could have happened in this position is instead of pawn to d4, Nakamura could have gone for pawn to b4 instead, and after pawn captures, then you go pawn to d4, and you have a very strong center by sacrificing a pawn here on the queen side, which is an idea I really like in this type of positions. But Nakamura decides to go for pawn to d4 instead, attacking the pawn here on g5 with the bishop like we mentioned. So Carlsen goes for pawn takes on d4, and after queen takes on d4, notice that now the queen is hitting the rook and the bishop is hitting this pawn here. So Carlsen is going to have to lose something, and he's not going to play this very ugly move, pawn to f6, weakening the light squares here on his king, which is very dangerous after a move like bishop to e2, bishop to h5, checkmate, right? So Carlsen decides to sacrifice a pawn, and he goes for knight to f6. The idea of this move, by sacrificing this pawn, is that after bishop takes here, he's going to in the future be able to use the open g file for the rook by sacrificing that pawn. So here, after bishop takes on g5, Carlsen continues developing his pieces with knight to c6, the queen moves to d3, and here Carlsen goes queen to b6, hinting that he wants to take here on b2, but also he's eyeing this square on f2 with some potential knight to g4 maneuvers later on in the game. So after queen to b6, attacking the pawn on b2 like we mentioned, Nakamura does a very strange move. He retreats with his bishop back to c1. Instead, I much rather take here on f6, and after pawn takes on f6, then we move this pawn either to b3 or to b4, and I think this would have been a lot better. We destroyed black's pawn structure. This king is still stuck in the center, and the only thing that black has in this position, not to mention that they're down a pawn, is that they have the bishop pair. But I don't think that's enough for this position, just the bishop pair. But instead, after bishop to c1, and who am I to question Nakamura's moves, right? Carlsen continues with knight to g4, and notice that now there's a nasty threat here on f2. Nakamura goes knight to h3, protects the pawn on f2 with the knight, and Carlsen goes pawn to d6, opening up the way for this bishop to come into the game later. Knight to c3, Nakamura develops a piece and now is threatening moves like knight to d5, maybe queen to b5, you know, exchanging queens. These are all possibilities now. Carlsen continues with knight g to e5. He puts pressure on this queen now that this pawn on f2 was well protected by this knight. And look at this move. The knight comes to e5, attacks the queen. But remember, when we open this diagonal for the bishop, now this bishop is going to be able to take this knight and remove the protection of the pawn on f2, which is very important. Nakamura here sees all those threats and decides that, okay, if I remove the queen from the game, then all these checkmate ideas are not going to be possible. So he decides to trade queens, and after queen takes on b5, bishop takes on d5, we develop our bishop, we pin the knight, and here Carlsen decides, you know what, I'm down a pawn, I might as well destroy white pawn structure. So he takes on h3, and after pawn takes on h3, Carlsen continues with pawn to a6, asking this bishop what he wants to do. Do you want to trade yourself for the knight, or do you want to do something else? He decides to do something else. He goes bishop back to e2. And this is a very clever move. Notice that this bishop is controlling a lot of key squares. If you just trade this bishop for the knight here on c6, then this knight is going to eventually be able to place itself here on c4 and have a lot of targets that, if you know, we can take care of by just moving this bishop back to e2 like Nakamura does. Here Carlsen continues with knight to d4. Notice that he really wants this bishop. He really wants to take it. And by playing this move, not only are we attacking the bishop on e2, but we're also attacking the pawn on c2. And Nakamura is not going to play a passive move now like bishop to d1. So most likely, we're going to win this bishop pair. And Nakamura decides to go for king to d1 and protecting the pawn with the king. Now, if this knight takes here, we have options to take also with the knight and placing this knight maybe in better squares like d4 or f4 in the future. So Carlsen decides to go for knight takes on e2, and like we mentioned, Nakamura recaptures with the knight, and now this pawn is going to be well supported by the king here. Carlsen decides to go for rook to c8. He's putting pressure down the c file, and Nakamura goes for pawn to b3. He wants to not only go bishop to b2, but in some cases he wants to protect this pawn with rook to a2, which is a very important theme here in this game. Carlsen continues with rook to g8. Remember, that was one of the main ideas by him sacrificing the pawn on g5, is that he wanted to make use of this open g file, which is doing right now with the rook. Nakamura continues to bishop to e3. He didn't put it here on b2. He realizes that this bishop is going to be better in this diagonal here, at the same time taking advantage of the fact that now this bishop doesn't have a lot of squares. The black bishop is stuck with only one square here. So after bishop to e3, Carlsen continues with pawn to b5. And I don't really like this move because this allows now white to actually be able to fix these pawns here by the move that he's going to play next, which is pawn to a4. And this move is an awesome move. The idea is that if you take, then we're going to open up our rook here with rook takes on a4, and we're going to have a very active rook attacking this very weak pawn here on a6. The other idea is that now, if you play pawn to b4, like Carlsen's going to do in the game, you're going to see that Nakamura is going to be able to fix this pawn here and make it a weakness for the rest of the game by playing the move pawn to a5. So at the b4, Naka goes pawn to a5, and notice these two pawns by black, they're very weak. We're going to be able to play moves like rook to a4, bishop to d2, putting a lot of pressure on this pawn here. Not to mention this knight can come here now. It's going to be a very bad position for black to play on from this moment on. Carlsen anticipates that there's going to be pressure on this pawn, and he goes for pawn to e6. At the moment, nothing is attacking this pawn, but at the moment that this rook comes here and this bishop comes here attacking the pawn on b4, Carlsen is going to be able to play moves like pawn to d5 and opening up the bishop, protecting the pawn, and then this rook can just slide over and also provide some protection. And this could potentially save black in the future. Notice that this pawn on a5 is also weak. So white has to be also aware of moves like rook to b8, rook to b5, and knight to c6 attacking this pawn here. So it's not all so clear for white. But here Nakamura goes rook to a2. Remember, this was a very clever idea when he pushed the pawn, which he wanted to put some protection on this pawn, and now his king is open to move around the board if he needs to. After bishop to e7, Carlsen decides, okay, I don't have any useful moves. Let me just put the bishop here, and maybe in the future it can go to d8, attacking this very important pawn here on a5. Here, Nakamura continues with knight to g3. The knight was not really doing much here on e2. He wants to reroute maybe to the king side, or maybe just block the rook from coming down the g-file. King to d7, Carlsen tries to centralize his king. Nakamura does the same with king to e2, and after bishop to d8, putting pressure on the pawn, Nakamura decides to go for rook to d1. And there's going to be a lot of nasty ideas now, around this pawn here on d6. Carlsen continues with rook to b8. Remember, he wants to go for this idea of rook to b5, putting pressure on this pawn, but he forgot about a very important thing. Now this pawn, remember, is going to be very loose. So after Nakamura goes pawn to f4, knight to c6, now he goes bishop to c5, not only attacking this pawn, but most importantly, this one here is being attacked by both the bishop and the rook, and there's not a lot of good defenses here by black. Carlsen tries bishop to c7, but Nakamura doesn't care. He wins the pawn anyway with bishop takes on d6, and after bishop takes on d6, this is the idea. Pawn to e5, and now there's nothing that this bishop can do. We're going to either take it with the rook or we're going to take it with the pawn. So after the king moves, Nakamura decides to keep the initiative, and he goes pawn takes on d6. And notice something, after Carlsen comes here to d7, this pass pawn is very dangerous. So if this knight ever comes to this square here on c5, this is going to be a deadly check. Not only is this knight going to support the idea of this pawn moving forward, but we're going to be attacking this pawn on a6. We're going to be able to take this pawn on b4 as well. So it's a very dangerous, I would say black is already losing in this position. So after king to d7, Nakamura goes for the mentioned plan with knight to e4. The rook comes with a check to g2. The king just moves to f3, and rook takes on h2. Carlsen says, well, I might as well take a pawn for all the troubles I'm in. Nakamura continues with knight to c5, and after the king comes to e8, Nakamura found the finishing move with rook to g1, attacking not only checkmate, but also a check, taking this rook in the future with ideas of pushing this pawn down to d7. In this position, there are not good ways for black to save themselves. So in this position, Carlsen decided to quit the game. Enough is enough. He wanted to go home. He wanted to forget about this game. And yeah, guys, that's today's game. Hope you liked it. Let me know down in the comments what you thought about this game. I'll see you guys on the next one. Bye-bye.